Years later, the party submitted a 45-page proposed settlement decree to the district judge here in Southern District. 12 months after the proposed settlement decree was submitted, the judge signed it and wrote a long opinion in his defense. An appeal was taken to the Second Circuit, and 15 more months went by before the Second Circuit, by a vote of 2-1, sustained the lower court's affirmance of the consent decree. Now is the summer of 1988, 17 years after the lawsuit was filed, and finally there is a decree which the courts have signed off on, and the parties do not go to the Supreme Court. That was 21 months ago, and to date there has been minimal compliance, and the attorneys for the plaintiffs are now moving for contempt against state officials. There are many sides to the enforcement problem, in addition to trying to make good on federal court orders. Let me offer you just one more. As lawyers, you will invariably run up against judges who are hostile. Hostile not to you personally, but hostile to the claims asserted by your clients. After this happens to you several times, you may, unfortunately, no longer notice it. That's probably regrettable, because meaningful change in the membership of the court and in the bar will require indignation at that kind of treatment. Nevertheless, in the beginning, it will certainly throw you, even if it doesn't later on. 20 years ago, when I was just beginning as an MFY legal services attorney, I appeared often in the New York State Family Court with some regularity on behalf of parents who were accused of child neglect and child abuse, or perhaps both. Perhaps it was my first hearing. I can no longer remember precisely. But it wasn't long after my first hearing, if it wasn't my first hearing, I was scheduled to appear before Judge Nicola DeMarco, a renowned family court judge who had been active in the American Civil Liberties Union, and I might say she was active when it really counted. She was active in the decades when being an ACLU lawyer caused a great deal of possible discrimination in established circles. She had been active in the ACLU long before she went on to the family court bench. I did not have a strong case, as I remember it, and it was only going to become a worse case if the prosecuting attorney was permitted to introduce hearsay evidence. I did a considerable amount of legal research, hoping to keep out much of this damaging material. But it was hardly an open and closed question, because in family court, the rules of evidence are relaxed compared to what they might be in another court. I actually had expectations that I might succeed. After all, the right of parents to raise their own child was a fundamental right. The hearsay rule not only deprived the party of the right to confront and cross-examine, but puts you as a defense lawyer in a case such as this in a rather hopeless and helpless position. After the hearing began, I made numerous objections, supported by considerable argument. At first, Judge DeMarco heard me out, and before overruling my point. But it wasn't long before Judge DeMarco turned to me, and I can remember this as though it happened just this morning, and she said something to the effect, "Counselor, these are interesting questions, but believe me, we simply do not have the time to allow you to continue to make out these arguments." Well, so much for process. So much for process before a respectable judge with a long history of commitment to ACLU principles. We lost the case. Maybe we should have lost the case. But whatever the case, however the hearing should have gone, if you had thought that due process was the guiding light, it certainly never went that way. A friend of mine at the time had a similar but slightly less varnished experience. He was told by a family court judge after making an objection based on the 14th Amendment, "Counselor, don't amendment me," end of quote. Now, these are disheartening enforcement stories. I relate them, though, not to completely discourage you, not to make you cynical, but to make plain the difficulties of enforcing, in many ways, hard-won legal norms, and to make plain the difficulties of actually trying to secure some of these legal norms. These stories, unfortunately, are not atypical, but they also do not describe all the enforcement experiences. Sometimes civil rights are not only won in the court or in the legislature, but the change is actually felt in communities. But the stories illustrate one aspect of civil rights law, the problem of making legal norms real. Bias in New York, bias in the nation, cause hardship and pain for many. It is not enough to adopt good laws or to win novel court rulings. We must enforce what we secure. Enforcement requires lawyers, lawyers who are good, lawyers who are committed. That is where you come in. We need your efforts. The work that needs to be done won't be done without you and folks like you. But with you, hopefully, we have a chance to make a better world. Thank you. I know we're running a little behind, and my talk wasn't the kind that would normally spark a set of specific questions. And so if there are really none, in order, out of deference to the schedule, maybe we would just go on. But I don't mind taking a few questions, but I know we're running a little late already.
We are running a bit behind, but I think everyone would agree it's worth it. We are getting a lot of information and certainly a lot of inspiration. Before introducing our next speaker, who is Matt Foreman, I wanted to point out the difficulty it is in creating a norm, as Professor Rudenstein had made reference to, in terms of societal norms. The question for Cardozo right now is, how can we pretend that we're treating people completely equally and with respect if we, as of yet, do not have in our anti-discrimination policy statement a statement against discrimination based on sexual orientation? We're one of the only schools in the United States that doesn't have that right now. And I personally urge that, and I'm sure that most of you would agree. The next speaker, Matt Foreman, is going to speak on violence against gays and lesbians, which is one of the highest incidents in our society of any group. And I would say that this school can do something to prevent that type of thing by recognizing the existence of people who have that lifestyle, and in effect humanizing and showing respect for that lifestyle and those people. And without any further comments, Matt Foreman is the executive director of an organization in New York called the Anti-Violence Project, which educates people and the government on issues relating to violence against gays and lesbians. And I'd just like you to welcome Matt Foreman.
Thanks for asking me to be here today. I have not really spoken to a group of law students for about 11 years, which is when I got out of law school at NYU. And I felt compelled to say that because I often feel that law students don't listen to, or lawyers don't believe that anyone else knows anything. Fortunately, I've never had the pleasure of practicing, so I'm sure I know nothing. I'd like to say I'm executive director of the Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project, not the Anti-Violence Project, and I think that's important. And what we do essentially is every day see crime victims who suffer who have been victims of crimes in New York City, and I would say that most everyone in New York City is affected by crime. To the extent that that's on the front lines, I guess that it is. I worked many years for the prison department, in which I was always on the side of inmates, and arguing strongly about their rights and how poorly they were treated and how abusive the system is, and I believe all of those things very much still. But 3 months into this job, my focus, my feelings are changing very much. One from advocacy for perpetrators and their constitutional rights and their legal rights and their human rights, to one of anger and reactionism. So to the extent that I sound angry today, I guess that I am only because I've been seeing so many victims who've been victimized, not just for crimes of opportunity, but more often simply because of the way who they are on account of their sexuality, or the way in which they are perceived to be. So I'd like to say just briefly today what I think the scope of the problem is, why it's the same and different than other forms of bias violence. Look at the recent murder in Staten Island as a case history of how we as a system respond differently to acts of violence against gay men and lesbians, and then very briefly about what might help, because I'm not at all sure about that. We do know that the problem of gay and lesbian violence is at epidemic levels now and is growing, as are all forms of bias violence. Violence against gay men and lesbians, however, is significantly more on the rise, at least as far as we can tell, than are other forms of bias. And I'm not sure that that's, I'm not going to say that's because, or to rule out that the gay and lesbian community is somewhat more organized than the people of color communities in this regard. There is no crime victim agency specifically targeted for African American victims of bias crime, or Hispanic Americans, or Asian Americans. We are the only specialized crime victim agency in the state. Globally, we know from 2 national surveys that 9 out of every 10 gay men, self-identified gay men and lesbians, are going to experience violence during their lives. And by violence, we mean something more than simply being called a faggot or a dyke. We mean some pushing or shoving incident that involves a physical touching. We know from a study at the University of Pennsylvania that gay men and lesbians are 7 times more likely than an average person, whatever that means, than the normal U.S. citizen, to be the victims of violence. We know from the Governor's Task Force on Bias-Related Violence in 1986 that gay men and lesbians are the most likely victim of bias violence, more so than any other minority community or ethnic community or religious community. What actually does that translate into in terms of numbers? I have to say I really don't know, because we also know from the United States Department of Justice 2 studies that between 75 and 85% of self-identified gay men and lesbians do not report a crime against them to anyone. To anyone. I'm not talking about the police. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. We do know that 688 people came to us last year, the Anti-Violence Project over on 13th Street, to report that they had been a victim of a crime. And half of those, 338 people, were victims of crime that were motivated, we determined, motivated because of their sexual orientation. In those crimes, there were 179, in those biased crimes, 338, there were 179 assaults. And half of those assaults required medical attention. Statistically speaking, that's an extremely high percentage. But I want to once again say that I don't really know. That in and of itself is a higher number of biased crimes than reported against any other group in the city. But I believe very strongly that that represents only the tip of a very ugly iceberg about what's going on out in the streets. The range of crimes are the range of crimes that happen to anyone in New York City. from petty harassment to police abuse to homicide. Last year there were 14 homicides of gay men, primarily gay men, no lesbians that were reported to us. Only 2 of them were homicides that were acquaintance homicides, that at least we've been able to tell were acquaintance homicides. That meant out of that 14, at least 12 we couldn't rule out bias as a factor. 6 of those were homicides of male prostitutes. We assume gay. We don't know if they were gay or not. And interesting to note, not one of those was classified by the police as a bias-motivated crime because of their relatively ridiculous and stringent criteria, in that in the crime itself there has to be at the outset a clear indication of bias, i.e. an epithet or something of that nature that says this is a biased crime. Well, most murder victims can't talk anymore to say, gee, as my throat was split, he called me a filthy faggot. It's hard to consider, though, crimes against gay male prostitutes as crimes of opportunity. Certainly they don't have money. Most of them, they're not being robbed. And we do know from both female prostitute experience and rape experience that many sick men kill a female prostitute or rape women and kill them because of the dirty woman, or because it triggers something in them that they are repulsed by, or they have done something that makes them sick to their stomach, and they have to kill that person for having enticed them into doing this. Nationwide, in 1988, there were 7,248 crimes reported to the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. A bill recently passed Congress that you may be aware of that requires criminal justice, law enforcement agencies across the country to report now to the U.S. Department of Justice bias-motivated crimes on account of ethnicity and sexual orientation and religion and race, not sex. And what is going to happen, and I think I'll say it now, so when it happens, people won't say it wasn't going to happen, that what is going to happen on account of that bill, which the gay community fought very hard for, is that the numbers of reported bias crimes are going to drop precipitously for the very reason that I just talked about here, about the bias criteria in New York City, which we believe to be a relatively sympathetic police department. That is, that we are expecting the police department of Charleston, West Virginia, which is where I'm from, to classify a biased crime, understand that this crime was biased, and then report it to the United States Department of Justice, which I think is a completely unrealistic expectation and isn't going to happen. And what's going to happen next year when these statistics come out is, 100 cases, probably. Maybe a few more. Maybe I'm just a cynic, but I think that's what's going to happen. Why do biased crimes against gay men and lesbians happen? I think they happen because of, for the same reasons, but a few different reasons, that violence happens against people of color, against ethnic groups, against religious groups. One is the universal, I guess, fear, hatred, rejection of what is different. The psychological need that's been pinpointed in many biased crimes of the perpetrator wanting to feel superior to the person that they are attacking. What has been learned and reinforced in society about what is normative, what is right. Certainly the churches, have reinforced the notion that homosexuality is evil. Certainly there is nothing anywhere in the media, except a few interesting Johnny Walker ads around here, that ever shows or implies that lesbian or gay relationships are okay. And the times that that has been tried, they have failed miserably. There's economic issues that apply to other issues of bias violence. As new groups of people move in and displace people that were there before, they become targets of violence. And that isn't new for yuppie gays. It's happened throughout the history, certainly of this city and other cities. As new waves of people come in displacing old waves, there is invariably violence. And that's in a nutshell some of the things that are the same. What's different about us, violence against gay men and lesbians? A couple of things. One of which is a relatively new phenomenon, and that's AIDS. That AIDS is now considered a factor in about 20% of bias crimes because it has given people an excuse to act out their homophobia. We are killing society. We are ruining the hospitals. We have ruined the blood supply. Interestingly, lesbians are very frequent targets of this argument. And I think we know that lesbians in general are the lowest risk population as far as AIDS goes. There's no rhyme or reason to, obviously, to bias. And the other thing that needs to be spoken about as far as homophobic violence is the internalized homophobia, which is often inside the person's head, the perpetrator's head. What we find very often is that the typical perpetrator of an attack of a biased homophobic attack is a person of the same race as the victim, 19 to 25 years of age, and of a middle-class background, middle to upper class, middle upwards class background. That's very different than the typical perpetrator, obviously. And a lot of it is, we believe, young men, particularly, not able or not having addressed their own sexuality or not having worked out their own sexuality in their head. And that in order to prove to other people or to themselves that they, yes, are indeed a man, they strike out, lash out with groups of other men, because many of these attacks are 3 or more people. They lash out at people that they perceive to be threatening to their manhood. Clearly the results of this violence are physical results of this violence are the same as violence against other classes of people. Broken arms, slashed faces, etc., etc., those are human things that happen, and they are the same. There's one thing different about homophobic violence. We heard earlier from a different speaker about the way in which we should change our appearance to avoid violence, or the things we should do to avoid violence. Well, you can't change the color of your skin. You can't change your sex. You can appear to be more assertive, but for many gay men and lesbians, the reaction that is expected and desired from the perpetrator, and the action that is in fact possible, is to become less gay or lesbian, to do some of the things we heard from an earlier speaker, to, if you're a woman, to appear more feminine, if you're a man, to appear more masculine. Those are things that can be done, and that is a reaction for many people, and it's the reason why a lot of people, we think, don't come out of the closet, and why a lot of people stay in the closet, and why a lot of people and a lot of the victims we see do all kinds of things to change who they are or how they want to be perceived. A couple of other different things about what happens if a person goes so far as to report the crime. A good example is there are robberies in Central Park are down over 70% since the Central Park jogging incident, because the police in response to that increased almost twofold the number of officers they had assigned to the park. And we could talk about all the racial implications of why they did that, So robberies are down by almost 70% in the park as a whole. In the Rambles, which is a gay cruising area, primarily we think, or our perception is, and I may be wrong, for men that don't identify themselves and certainly are not out as gay men, robberies are up 66%. And that's reported crimes, and what men do when they are robbed in the Rambles. Are you all familiar with Rambles? It's like this twisting pathway over like between 79th and 72nd and 81st Street, something like that, on the west side, is the men will go over to Central Park West in front of these glamorous buildings and say, I was mugged here. I was beaten up here. Or they go home and say, it happened on... They don't say where it happened. But those who do say where it happened, I was, if they have the courage to say, I was in the Rambles, I was looking for sex, and I was robbed, and mugged, and brutalized, if they do say that, there's something that happens for those people that doesn't necessarily happen for other crime victims, and that is the cop on the beat mocking them, making fun of them, discounting the bias in the incident. When they do go before, if they do get through the process and decide to endure the criminal justice process, which is hell for everyone, if they do decide to do that, the same issues that come up with female rape victims come up with these victims. We have a man who was beaten up on 9th Avenue and 8th Avenue and 21st Street in front of the Rawhide Bar. Man called him a faggot. He said, fuck you. The guy had a piece of wood that was by a trash can there, picked it up, and proceeded to beat the pulp out of him. The man's now going to court. He happens to be an AIDS activist. What are all the questions that have happened in the pretrial conferences and ever? Have you ever been in the Rawhide Bar? Why were you in the Rawhide Bar? Have you ever had sex in the Rawhide Bar? Have you ever had sex with other men? Have you ever had sex outdoors? Have you? Same series of questions that happen to female rape victims. Now, this man is out, so not such a problem. You're an associate at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, and you're not there. I don't want to put down Cravath, Swaine & Moore because I'm not sure this is the case with them. I'm just using their name. So please, anyone who's going there next year, don't take offense with this. Unless you are there gay, and they seem to get one every couple of years to be the house gay, unless you're the house gay, that really is not going to go too well with your partnership chance. And as bad as the situation is for African Americans, I can't think of a word that's, as horrific as the partnership situation is for African Americans in law firms in New York City. The situation is worse for open gay men and lesbians. I actually saw one who died of AIDS in the Times this week, and that was like, and I do know of two others, but so there's that whole other aspect that comes into these when you report the crime and you are gay or lesbian, that opens up that whole spectrum of discrimination. And I have to say that when I was in law school and thinking about these things and being in New York City, and I'm sure at Cardozo we think that things are not so bad. I'm sure you all don't think that things are so bad, but I think there's a perception that things aren't so bad. Well, and that people can be out and get ahead, and we always hold up our house gay as the person who got ahead. And I saw the new editor of the Harvard Law Review who got ahead. But the reality is completely different, and I can't say that strongly enough, that people have reason to fear coming out. Do I approve of them not coming out? No. But do they have reason? Big reason. And it's not just job. It goes right down the line with family and all those other things that are critical to people's lives. Now, so there are differences in that spectrum. And I sound like the professional victim here saying how awful things are for us. I think they are. That's why I'm saying it. So I apologize for that. What is the reaction to biased crime as a society as a whole against homophobic crime? I think very, very different. I'm not expecting people to change millennia of internalized homophobia and what they've been taught. I'm not expecting the masses to suddenly change. But I would expect that the politicians, particularly here in this city, which I'm using because I'm here now, to act on what they say. On January 22nd, we had the classic, best, most fabulous murder, homophobic murder ever. And I know that sounds callous, but it's the truth about this case. You may have read about it, maybe not. A man was hunted down over many hours by two men. He was beaten very badly. He was stabbed. They slashed his throat. They cut out his heart. And they did it quite proudly, quite stupidly. They admitted that they did it because the man was gay. And in their tape confessions, which are chilling beyond belief, they say, "I don't know what I did. He was only a fag." And pictures of them. They're your mother's worst enemy of a creature from the deep. I mean, they're like, oh, God, they're awful. They have a history of gay bashing. In 1986, they tricked a man into his car on Staten Island in the parking lot. Two of them and two other guys hopped in the car with him, beat him up, raped the man with a crowbar, put him in the trunk, and decided they needed to get beer, of course, because they had a weighty decision, and the weighty decision was, how are we going to kill this individual? And they got into a fight in front of this deli on Staten Island that had an apartment above it to say, should we run the car into the ocean and drown him, or should we put a match down the gas tank and explode him? Well, these two guys wanted to drown him, and the other two guys wanted to set him on fire, and they had this loud argument across the car about how they're going to do it. Well, an old lady up in the upstairs apartment heard them, called the police, and said, I really think this is a crazy call, but... And the police arrived. The man lived. Significant brain damage, and guess what? Is scared to death to go before the jury to prosecute this case fully because he doesn't want anyone to know that he was gay and that he was in South Beach parking lot looking for sex. And the men get off with robbery and serve a couple of years, and they come out this year and they do this again. Anyway, thugs, evil, icky people. The victim, a Vietnam veteran who comes home mentally impaired from the war, but not crazy. A simple guy who mows everybody's lawn on the street. Everyone loves him. He goes to church every day. His parents love him. They all know he's gay. The perfect victim, the helpless lamb. And I say that sounding crass, but I know the family very well, and it's hard for me to say that, but I'm trying to paint in starkest terms. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Well, what's the response? It takes the mayor 3 days to issue a statement. Not one borough president of the city of New York, except for Ruth Messenger, issued a statement of condemnation for 4 days, and that was only after we harangued them day and night. And two of the borough presidents, Bronx and Staten Island, didn't even mention that this was a biased crime, let alone that the man was a homosexual. Universal silence from the assembly persons. The